Okay, to continue where we left off, is with what's often referred to as America's first party system. It's changed over time. The first president, George Washington, was largely nonpartisan, although towards the end of his presidency, it was clear that he was the leader of the Federalist faction, while Jefferson was leader of the so-called Democratic Republicans. Don't confuse these parties with any party that is currently alive today. This is not the Republican Party of Donald Trump. This is the Republican Party of Thomas Jefferson. The modern-day Republican Party was founded as a free soil response to slavery in the 1850s, and the first Republican president was Abraham Lincoln. So this is a different Republican Party. It's also sometimes referred to as the Democratic Republican Party. It's not the current Democratic Party. That party was established in the 1820s and is largely associated with the rise of Andrew Jackson. So these are two different parties than the parties we have today, but nevertheless they were our two first parties. One, the Federalist parties, they believed in a strong federal government. They wanted to interpret the Constitution as loosely as possible to allow them to do things like fund the national debt and open the national bank. This party is on the side of big business and manufacturing, and they want a strong government because they want a strong and orderly economic system. Thomas Jefferson's Democratic Republicans are more in favor of states' rights over the federal government. They want the Constitution to be interpreted very strictly, and they take the side of the country farmer over the big business city dweller. There's also an international side to this. During this period, the French Revolution begins, and that creates a lot of tension on the world stage, and eventually France and England will go to war with one another. As the French Revolution becomes less stable and more violent, it creates a lot of concern, especially among the Federalists. So the Jeffersonians are closer allied to France, while the Federalists are more closely allied with England. And that'll be important as the Adams presidency develops. There's John Adams. Missed him in the last lecture. He will run against Jefferson for the presidency in 1896. Adams will win, but under the system that was in place by the Constitution, the person who received the most votes in the Electoral College, John Adams, became president. The person who received the second most votes in the Electoral College became vice president. That was Thomas Jefferson. So as you can imagine, that was a bit of a tense relationship. These two sides, the two opposite sides of the American political of the two political parties are having to serve together in the same presidency as president and vice president. That system will also create problems in 1800, and it will be changed with the 12th Amendment before the 1804 election. So here's a quick breakdown of how this election shook out. You can see how the Electoral College votes were allocated, and as I just said before, ratification of the 12th Amendment in 1804, each elector cast votes for two different candidates. The candidate with the highest number of votes became president, while the candidate with the second highest total became vice president. So a bit of a mess, something the founders thought was going to work when they created the Electoral College, but they did not plan on such a partisan development. They actually thought political parties wouldn't work that well in America because America was such a large country, geographically speaking. As we know, those parties developed shortly after the founding, and it led to the sort of problem and the fix required by the 12th Amendment. One of the first problems that Adams will face will be an international crisis. It's often called the quasi-war because we were essentially in a naval war with France, and French ships were attacking American ships were attacking French ships, and this all had to do with the country's attempt to stay neutral during the French Revolution and then the subsequent war between France and England. France didn't very much like that we were trading with England and not trading with France, and this led to the war and a number of developments internationally that made Adams very unpopular. It's a famous event known as the XYZ affair, where Adams was attempting to negotiate with some French diplomats. They forced the American diplomats to basically pay a bribe to get to see the French diplomats. This was revealed in the press, and Adams was ridiculed, especially by the opposition party. What maybe made Adams more unpopular than anything else was a set of laws that were passed by the Congress and signed by the president, known as the Alien and Sedition Acts. These were widely seen as an attempt to gain political power. It gave the president quite a bit of power over foreign nationals, and also it allowed the law to punish people who criticized the government. So the Alien Act allowed the president to deport any alien considered dangerous. That's a lot of power, obviously. It also extended the amount of time that a foreign alien had to wait to become a U.S. citizen from 5 years to 14 years. Again, these laws were seen to favor the Federalists because most immigrants tended to vote for the Democratic Republicans. So this is making a longer wait for them to actually become citizens and vote. And also the president can pick and choose who he wants to stay in the country, which significantly strengthened the Federalists. So there's the other acts, and probably the most unconstitutional of these acts was the Sedition Act, which allowed the government to imprison anyone who criticized the president or the government. Obviously a violation of the First Amendment. In response to the Alien and Sedition Acts, the governments of Virginia and Kentucky issued resolutions. They were written in secret by James Madison, the father of the Constitution, and Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration, and obviously also the leader of the States' Rights Party. The important thing here is that in these resolutions, although they did not advocate for secession, they did assert that the states have the right to nullify unconstitutional laws passed by Congress. This is really important because it's going to be the same argument used by the Southern states during the nullification crisis of the 1830s, and then again when the Southern states secede, leading to the Civil War. That brings us to the election of 1800. It would actually be Adams running against Jefferson. This is the man running with Jefferson on the Democratic ticket, Mr. Aaron Burr. So we now have vice president and president running together on the same ticket, but the problem with the allocation of the electoral votes hasn't been figured out yet. The election of 1800 was a very nasty campaign between Adams and Jefferson. These two men had been great friends during the Declaration period of the writing of the Declaration. They worked together on the Declaration. By this time, they're political enemies, and it gets pretty personal and ugly. They have a bad falling out, and then they're not brought together again until much later when they're both fairly elderly, and they begin writing letters back and forth to one another and rekindle their friendship. And the two men, Jefferson and Adams, would both die on July 4th, exactly 50 years after the Declaration of Independence was written. They died on the same day, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration. So here's how the election fell out in 1800. By the way, the 3/5 clause played a very important role in getting Jefferson elected here. As you know, the 3/5 clause counted enslaved human beings in the South as 3/5 of a person for congressional proportional representation. So it also determined the number of electors in the Electoral College. And it has been determined that if those enslaved humans weren't counted as part of congressional proportion representation, Adams would have won the election in 1800 pretty handily. So a problem arises because both Jefferson and Burr received exactly 73. Somebody missed the memo that they were not supposed to cast one of their ballots for Burr. So because of the tie, this election was sent to the House of Representatives to make the final decision. They had to choose between Jefferson and Burr. Burr refused to kind of give in. He thought he'd stand pat. And eventually the members of the Congress, of the House of Representatives, determined that Jefferson and Burr, remember, these are a lot of Federalists still, they decided that Jefferson was the lesser of two evils. And so Jefferson becomes president, Burr becomes vice president. Burr, as sitting vice president, would shoot Alexander Hamilton to death in a duel, in a very famous incident. So there's Burr. He was one of the founding fathers. His name has sort of been dragged through the mud, not just because of he killed Hamilton, but also because of a plot he had to go down and create an independent sovereign nation down in the Louisiana territories. And he eventually was brought up on charges for that and acquitted. Okay, so now here's setting up Marbury for you. So after the election, John Adams and most of the Federalist Congress are lame ducks. They are going to be out of a job in early 1801, so they quickly passed legislation creating a stronger, a bigger judiciary. They want to pack the judiciary full of federal judges, so even though they're losing the House, Senate, and the presidency, they'll still have some power within the judicial branch. As part of this, John Marshall becomes Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And along with this, as part of this act, John Adams creates a lot of new judgeships. Important here is he appoints William Marbury to become Justice of the Peace in Washington, D.C. The Jefferson administration is going, and his Secretary of State, James Madison, are going to refuse to give this commission to Marbury, and the case is going to make its way to the Supreme Court. It's going to begin in the Supreme Court, which, as you will see, is part of the problem. So this is going to be the case you read for this week, Marbury versus Madison, which establishes the principle in law of judicial review. So that's the background, and enjoy the case.